What if a nation could reclaim vast stretches of land territory disputed for generations without launching a single attack or sacrificing a single soldier, relying instead on patience, leverage, and political brilliance that most of the world never even noticed happening in real time? Saudi Arabia did exactly that, quietly reshaping its borders and restoring lands once thought permanently lost, using a playbook so strategic and so subtle that historians today call it one of the most impressive diplomatic victories in modern Middle Eastern history. Saudi Arabia sits at the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, yet for nearly a century, its greatest challenge was not expanding influence outward, but securing the lands around the territories shaped by tribes, colonial lines, and conflicting historical claims that left the nation surrounded by uncertainty. Instead of turning to force, Saudi leaders understood that stability was more valuable than brute power, and they crafted a long-term strategy built on negotiation, economic bargaining, and carefully timed alliances that allowed them to settle border disputes without a single major war. Many countries in similar situations leaned on military strength to resolve territorial disagreements. But Saudi Arabia recognized early that war could fracture the region, disrupt oil markets, and undermine its rise as a modern global player. So it began to master the art of diplomacy, offering economic support, sharing oil revenues, and using political influence in ways that made cooperation more appealing than confrontation for its neighbors. From Jordan to Kuwait, from Oman to Yemen, each agreement was a calculated move in a decades-long chess match, where Saudi Arabia traded small concessions for deeper strategic wins that expanded its coastline, secured vital desert regions, and legitimized its historical control over disputed lands. What unfolded wasn't a story of conquest, but of quiet persuasion, patient statecraft and negotiating power so effective that it permanently changed the map of the Arabian Peninsula without a single battlefield. Saudi Arabia's territorial story begins in a time when borders across the Arabian Peninsula were not defined by precise maps, but by shifting tribal influence, seasonal migration routes, and agreements made through trust rather than formal documentation. This created a complex landscape where the rise of modern nation-states collided with centuries of fluid boundaries, leaving countries like Saudi Arabia with disputes that could have easily escalated into conflict. When Ibn Saud unified the kingdom, the map of Arabia still looked more like a rough sketch than a modern border chart, and no one knew exactly where one nation ended and another began. Instead of forcing clarity with weapons, Saudi Arabia chose to expand legitimacy through governance, diplomacy, and the slow process of building a stable state that neighboring tribes could align with rather than fight. As global powers like Britain withdrew from the region, the colonial borders they left behind were inconsistent and sometimes contradictory, creating overlapping claims that set the stage for potential wars. Saudi Arabia understood that stepping into these disputes aggressively would trigger regional instability, so it began using patience as a geopolitical weapon, allowing negotiation to take the place of confrontation. The kingdom's leadership realized early that war threatened the one resource that had the power to transform the nation oil, because any instability in the peninsula could disrupt production, weaken global trust, and sabotage economic growth. This awareness pushed Saudi Arabia to pursue diplomacy not as an option but as a core national strategy, enabling it to shape borders in a way that secured long-term prosperity. One of the kingdom's most brilliant diplomatic moves was the 1965 agreement with Jordan, which transformed a potential territorial conflict into a mutually beneficial exchange that strengthened both countries. Saudi Arabia gave up a small inland area but gained a valuable coastline extension along the Gulf of Aqaba, allowing more access to trade routes without any military tension. This deal, viewed globally as a masterclass in border negotiation, showed other regional players that Saudi Arabia could resolve disputes creatively rather than aggressively. By choosing partnership over pressure, the kingdom signaled that diplomacy could deliver strategic victories more enduring than any battlefield win. Another example of Saudi Arabia's calculated diplomacy was the peaceful resolution of shared oil fields in the Kuwait Neutral Zone, an area that had the potential to ignite severe conflict due to its massive reserves. Instead of clashing over extraction rights, both nations agreed to jointly administer and benefit from the region, producing one of the most stable resource-sharing models in the world. This collaborative approach strengthened political bonds and preserved regional stability, proving that the kingdom's influence grew not only through economic power but through its ability to negotiate outcomes where all parties gained something. Such gestures built trust, making future agreements easier and more productive. The most sensitive and historically complex dispute involved Yemen, where the regions of Nahran, Asir, and Jazan had been debated for decades. Saudi Arabia gradually strengthened its claim by investing in infrastructure, empowering local tribes, and extending administrative control without provoking armed confrontation. As Yemen faced internal political fragmentation, Saudi Arabia strategically used economic support and diplomatic outreach to create conditions favorable for a peaceful settlement rather than a violent standoff. This culmination resulted in the 2000 Judea Treaty, where Yemen officially recognized the disputed regions as Saudi territory, ending generations of ambiguity through a pen rather than a sword. Saudi Arabia's diplomacy with Oman revealed a similar pattern of patience, long-term planning, and respect for regional stability. For decades, the border across the empty Quarteran, enormous desert region remained ambiguous, but the kingdom avoided any military posturing, focusing instead on technical surveys and political dialogue. Ivenco, Wali, both nations reached a comprehensive agreement that clarified territorial lines while strengthening economic and security ties, demonstrating that mutual benefit could replace historic uncertainty. Saudi Arabia gained undisputed control over strategic desert zones, while Oman secured stable borders and shared development opportunities. Relations with the United Arab Emirates also required meticulous negotiation, especially regarding the Shabaa oil field and the surrounding desert triangle. Although tensions occasionally surfaced, Saudi Arabia avoided escalation by relying on arbitration, documented historical claims, and diplomacy aimed at maintaining unity within the Gulf Cooperation Council. This approach prevented minor disputes from turning into major conflicts, preserving a regional alliance crucial for both economic and political stability. By prioritizing cooperation over confrontation, the kingdom reinforced its leadership role in the Gulf while securing territory that might otherwise have become a long-term source of tension. Saudi Arabia's handling of border issues with Qatar reflected the same commitment to balancing firmness with diplomacy, especially as the Gulf states navigated shifting alliances and geopolitical challenges. Even during periods of political tension, the kingdom avoided territorial aggression, instead using negotiation and regional frameworks to resolve issues related to land access and regional security. This steady approach allowed Saudi Arabia to maintain influence without undermining the unity of the Gulf bloc, which remained essential for economic integration, defense coordination, and long-term development. Every diplomatic success strengthened the kingdom's political maturity and expanded its influence in ways that force could never achieve. Across all these negotiations, Saudi Arabia leveraged economic strength as a negotiation tool, offering investment, trade routes, and financial support to neighboring nations facing internal or external pressures. Instead of using these tools as coercive threats, the kingdom presented them as incentives, creating win-win arrangements that made peaceful border resolution the most logical choice. This strategy turned Saudi Arabia into a regional stabilizer, granting it a unique position where other nations preferred cooperation, because the benefits outweighed any potential geopolitical rivalry. Slowly and consistently, the map of the Arabian Peninsula began to reflect agreements shaped by diplomacy rather than conquest. The kingdom also understood the value of timing, often waiting for moments when neighboring countries were more open to compromise, either due to political transitions, economic challenges, or shifts in global alliances. By striking agreements during these windows, Saudi Arabia secured outcomes that favored its national interests without creating resentment or resistance. This mastery of patience allowed the kingdom to achieve territorial certainty in regions where other countries would have resorted to conflict, proving that strategy sometimes requires waiting as much as acting. Over time, this turned Saudi diplomacy into a respected model within Middle Eastern geopolitics. As the modern era unfolded, Saudi Arabia continued refining its diplomatic playbook, using legal documentation, historical evidence, and international partnerships to reinforce its claims and maintain peaceful borders. This shift away from force and towards structured negotiation represented a significant evolution in how regional disputes were managed. What emerged was a nation that used intelligence, timing, and economic leverage more effectively than military power, demonstrating a unique path to territorial stability. The kingdom's decisions set a precedent that military might is not the only tool nations can use to shape their future. Ultimately, Saudi Arabia reclaimed disputed lands not through domination, but through the quiet craft of diplomacy that moved slowly yet decisively. Each agreement built a stronger, more stable kingdom, proving that patience, negotiation, and strategic foresight can redraw borders more powerfully than any army. Saudi Arabia's journey to reclaim its lost lands without firing a single shot stands as one of the most remarkable geopolitical achievements of the modern era. proving that strength doesn't always come from the battlefield but from the negotiating table. By choosing diplomacy over destruction, the kingdom rewrote its borders while preserving stability for millions of people across the peninsula. Through patience, strategic alliances, and economic leverage, Saudi Arabia showed that long-term vision can outperform short-term aggression and that nations can gain more through cooperation than conflict. This approach didn't just secure land, it secured trust, influence, and regional leadership that military force could never guarantee in a region often defined by explosive rivalries and historical grievances. The kingdom's method offered a new blueprint for resolving disputes in ways that protect lives and create lasting partnerships. Every agreement forged without war strengthened its reputation as a stabilizing power capable of guiding the region toward a more collaborative future. The story of Saudi Arabia's border victories reminds us that diplomacy is not weakness, but a higher form of strategy, one that requires discipline, patience, and the ability to think generations ahead. These qualities allowed the kingdom to expand its control, safeguard its resources, and build relationships that continue to shape the Middle East today. As the world watches new geopolitical tensions rise, Saudi Arabia's example raises an important question about the path forward for global conflicts. Will nations continue choosing war, or will they recognize the power of negotiation to achieve what violence never can? The kingdom's success suggests that the most lasting victories are won not with weapons, but with wisdom, timing, and the courage to seek peace when war seems easier.